What Are the Odds by Mike Lindell. From Crack Addict to CEO. Continued. Chapter 31. I'll wait you out. Omen or not, things went downhill fast. Rachel returned that afternoon, and we immediately resumed the argument we'd left off days before. She told me she'd called the police on me. What for? I didn't know, but it had resulted in a warrant for my arrest. The cops, she said, were on their way. But I haven't done anything, I protested. I fled the house and jumped into Rachel's car. I sped out of the driveway and drove 3 miles to Carver, only using her vehicle because I'd left my truck elsewhere. Once in town, I abandoned Rachel's car and ran the few blocks to my old house, the one in foreclosure, where I asked Darren to give me a ride to my truck. Later that day, a cop called me and asked me if I stole Rachel's car. No, I said. The officer changed his tactics. Mike, he said, if you had stolen Rachel's car, where would you have put it? Halfway up the hill by the church in Carver on the left side of the road. Thanks, Mike. And you can come and meet us? And can you come and meet us? We just want to talk to you. Is he kidding? I thought. No, I'm not going to meet you, and don't bother coming to look for me, I said. I haven't done anything wrong. Quickly, I hung up. Already, it seemed, the fifth caller from the night before had been right. After retrieving my truck, I drove to Minneapolis to see my main dealer, Joe, a stocky, muscled up guy who had grown up in the Chicago projects. Joe was the kind of man who might scare you if you ran into him alone on a dark street. But he really was the nicest guy. He lived in an apartment downtown, and with a warrant out for my arrest, I thought his house would be a good place to hide out for a while. It wasn't fair season, and my salespeople, as well as independently contracted vendors, were doing shows without me. That meant I could conduct a lot of my business by phone. So I hung out at Joe's day after day, converting cash into coke, then converting coke into crack. I hadn't slept since the day the weird phone calls started. That day rolled into 3 days, and three rolled into five, then seven, then 10. I was playing through, troubleshooting my life as I continued to watch it slip through my fingers. Though I had made it through the walking coma, as the doctor called it, I knew I was still crumbling inside. I was an expert at self sabotage, so even though I had good intentions to quit drugs, turn over a new financial leaf, be a better parent, build my business, I always managed to dig a hole under my own feet. I was supposed to attend to some important My Pillow business, but I avoided it, hitting the crack pipe constantly instead. If I stayed high, I could avoid the inner pain I was feeling, pain like I'd never felt in my life. Time sped by in a blur, each day fading into the next. Before I realized it, I had been awake for 2 weeks straight. On the 14th day, I was in Joe's bathroom when I heard the front door to the apartment open and shut a couple of times. Then I heard multiple voices. It sounded like Joe had company. I opened the bathroom door and walked out. Two other men were standing there, and all three, including Joe, were glaring at me. I knew the other two guys. There was Tiggs, the youngest of the bunch, but a powerful dealer in his own right. And there was Ray, a black suburban professional who moved large quantities of coke to a few select clients without ever missing a day at his real job. Ray was the one who had told me never to touch crack. I drew back and looked at them. You guys know each other? We do and we don't, and that don't matter, said Tiggs, who suddenly turned as mean and tough as I'd ever seen him. Joe called us and said, "You've been up for 14 days. You need to go to bed. We're cutting you off." I started to argue, and Ray, who was already disgusted with me, interrupted me. "What's the matter with you? Don't even call me, man." He walked out the apartment door. Tiggs then issued Joe some instructions, and Joe walked out too. Now Tiggs turned to me. "How much you got left?" "A couple of rocks," I said. "All right, I'm gonna wait you out." Tiggs walked over, sat on Joe's sofa, and crossed his legs. Then he threw up his hand and gave me a, "Well, what are you waiting for? Look, you ain't getting no more, so you may as well finish what you've got," he said. I couldn't believe this. My own dealers were doing an intervention? I sat down in a chair across from Tiggs, prepped my pipe, and smoked a rock. As he gazed at me through a cloud of his own pot smoke, I thought, nah, I'll wait you out. 20 or 30 minutes passed between rocks in the intervals I got on my phone and ignored Tiggs. After loading my pipe a few times, I finally burned through my last rock. Tiggs was still gazing at me from the couch. He had a small, secret smile on his face that I didn't quite understand. Another 20 minutes passed. I could feel myself count coming down. With the number of days I'd been awake, I knew it was going to be one of the worst come downs I'd ever had. Also, I did not want to come down because I hadn't figured out my own future yet. I hadn't found a way to escape the pain. I scraped my pipe for residue and smoked at that. When it was gone, I farmed on the floor and smoked anything I found that resembled crack. After a few hours of this standoff, I was dying for my drug. It was unbearable. That's when I looked over at Tiggs and saw that he'd fallen asleep. Ha! I thought. I won. Twisting the knob quietly, I slipped out Joe's front door, took the stairs two at a time, and headed for the street. I was out there for only an hour, winding my way through the dark. Dealers and addicts buzzed at the corners like bees around hives. Each time I approached someone, the reaction was different. Some turned and walked away. Others said, "Nah, man, can't sell to you." It was like I had some kind of disease. In desperation, I started offering $50 for $20 worth of crack, but it didn't take me long to realize I could have offered $500 with the same result. That's how quickly and thoroughly Joe had gotten the word out. It turned out that Tig's instructions to Joe were simple. Pass the word in the street that if anyone sells to a crazy looking white guy with a mustache, they're done. Confused and angry, I climbed the stairs back up to Joe's place and walked in to find Tiggs awake and still sitting on the couch. He gave me a small smile. "How'd that work out for you?" he said. I lost my cool. "What's the matter with you guys? All I want is more stuff. You've sold to me all this time, and now you're cutting me off?" Tiggs ignored my outburst. "Give me your phone," he said. "I'm going to take a picture of you." I don't know why, but I obeyed, and Tiggs snapped the photo. You've been telling us for years that this pillow thing is some kind of platform, and that you're going to come back here and help us get out of this drug life," Tiggs said. "Well, we're not going to let you die on us. You're going to bed. You ain't got no choice." He tossed my phone and I caught it. "There you go," he said. "Put that picture in your damn book." Tiggs was right. I didn't have a choice. I'd been up for 14 days, and without more crack, I was done. Shooting him an irritated look, I trudged back to Joe's spare bedroom and shut the door behind me. There wasn't even a bed in there, just a blanket. It was about 2:30 in the morning when I curled up on the floor and I finally fell asleep. When I opened my eyes, it was dark. The sun had already risen and set again. For the next dozen hours or so, I drifted in and out of consciousness, not because I needed more sleep, but because I didn't want to wake up and face what was out there. On the second full morning, I jolted awake and sat up. Somehow, my subconscious had dredged up a reminder, that important My Pillow business I'd been avoiding. It was that critical paperwork I'd been working on for Corey the night of the weird phone calls. Those papers would seal a deal with a company that had committed to a huge wholesale buy from My Pillow. This deal was crucial to keeping the company afloat, and today was the deadline. It was about 25 miles back to Carver. I didn't want to go back there because I knew there was still a warrant out for my arrest. But Corey had to get those papers. When I opened the bedroom door, the apartment was empty. Once outside, I jumped in my truck and headed toward home. Calling ahead, I learned that Corey was at our schoolhouse facility. So that's where I went. But just as I pulled into the parking lot, I saw a police cruiser pulling out. The cop U-turned, flashed his lights, whooped his sirens, and pulled me over. Immediately, I flipped open my cell phone and called Rachel. "I'm getting arrested right now," I pleaded. "Please, go down to the courthouse and withdraw these false charges." Rachel agreed and I hung up. Grabbing the My Pillow papers, I jumped out of my truck. I absolutely had to get these papers to Corey, and there was no way I'd make the deadline if I was sitting in jail. The police officer was exiting the cruiser, and I recognized him as someone I knew, Officer Larry. My mind raced. I can run, I thought. I'll get the papers to Corey, then come back and surrender. I turned to make a break for it. "Mike, stop right now!" Larry yelled. "I have a warrant for your arrest. Whatever that is in your hands, I want you to put it down." I put up my hands, holding the papers in my right one. "Larry, I know I know I've got a warrant, but these papers need to get to my brother, or it's going to change the course of history. My Pillow is going to be gone if I don't, and My Pillow is a platform for something so important in the future, something to do with God. So many people will be affected if my brother doesn't get these papers." I know that sounds crazy and grandiose, but that's what I had dreamed, and it wasn't just me. That's what Cindy told me. That's what those weird callers had told me, too. Officer Larry just stood there staring at me. "You know what, Larry?" I went on. "Rachel's down at the courthouse straightening all this out right now, and the charges are going to be dropped. I'm going to be found innocent, and if I'm not, I promise you can arrest me anytime, and I'll promise I'll have cocaine on me when you do." Larry looked at me for another moment and sighed. "Call your brother," he said. In the end, it was a compromise. Larry showed me to the back of his squad car, and I called Corey. Not one for confrontation. Corey didn't want to come out. He sent my brother-in-law Brian out instead. Brian came out to the parking lot, and Larry gave him the papers before arresting me, and the following Tuesday I was found innocent. Chapter 32. Death Spiral. One definition of a miracle is something that defies the laws of science or nature. In my case, the laws of probability in mathematics seemed constantly at odds with actual events. As one event piled on top of another, Cindy's warnings, the phone calls, the dealer intervention, I found myself really coming to grips with the idea that God was trying to send me a message. This all hit me one Saturday in March 2008, about a month after the dealers turned downtown Minneapolis against me. I was holed up in a friend's apartment in the city with another friend, Dale Wind, smoking crack. I told him about what my dealers had done and how I kept meeting people and convincing them to quit. I shared the whole story of Michael, the guy I'd smoked crack with in Las Vegas, before putting him on a train back home to his family. I also told Dale about Tony, the guy I'd met in Memphis on that card counting trip. How Tony had come to Memphis to visit his uncle, who owned a chicken restaurant. How he'd spent all his money on drugs. How he spent all that time smoking crack with Gary and me, then rescued us when the cops picked us up in Memphis. How I gave him a few $100s and told him to quit crack and go home. I never found out what happened to Tony, I told Dale, but this has happened so many times. It seems like I can convince other people to quit, but I never can. Dale and I got into a deep conversation about God. I shared my what are the odds way of looking at things and confided that I felt God was sending me a message. I also said I was ready to quit and once again found myself giving the same lecture I had given to many of my friends over the years. Dale said he was ready to quit too, and we made a pact. We'd quit together. I picked up my cell and called Cindy. I'm quitting, I told her when she picked up the phone. Cindy knew I was an addict, but not how deeply I was into drugs. She thought I was only into cocaine. In any case, she'd heard me vow to quit many times before. Well, if you're quitting, she said, not quite sarcastically, why don't you come to church with Brian and me tomorrow? I'd always felt like Cindy was a spiritual gateway for me. Not that she had some special pipeline to God or anything, but it seemed like she had long been close to God, and I could see that her faith was strong and steady. Maybe Cindy's kind of faith was what I needed to finally break free. She and Brian were still going to Living Word, the church they drove an hour to reach each Sunday. Since Dale and I happened to be in Minneapolis, the church was only about 5 miles away. Okay, I said, I'll have a friend with me. He's quitting too. Since we had committed to quitting in the morning, Dale and I agreed it would be a good idea to head downtown and get one last batch of Coke. We started looking for a dealer, somebody besides Joe, for obvious reasons. It was after 2 a.m., and all the bars that served liquor were closed, but we saw the lights on at a show club, so we parked and went in. Inside, I started sizing up the crowd, trying to spot somebody who would sell to me. We hadn't been standing at the bar 30 seconds when a guy walked up and said, Hey, are you from here? Yeah, I said. Do you know where Fridley is? He'd come into town on a red-eyed flight, the stranger said, and got lost while trying to find this other town. Yeah, Fridley's north of here. Where are you from? Memphis, he said. Really? I was just telling my friend here a good Memphis story, I said. I gave the stranger a 15-second version of that crazy trip. He drew back his head and gave me a weird look. Is your name Mike? Yeah, I said. And you're a gambler? Yeah, why? Do you know a guy named Tony? My neck tingled. Yeah. The man's eyes grew wide. After that trip, Tony got clean, and now he owns a bunch of chicken restaurants. He said you saved his life. He calls you the angel from the north. I didn't know what to say. I was blown away. And my friend Dale, he was completely freaked out. We had just been talking about God, about odds, about all the coincidences that kept happening to me. I had told him the Tony story not more than an hour ago. And now we walk into a random bar in downtown Minneapolis and learn from a complete stranger what happened to the guy. Dale shook his head slowly in disbelief. I'm done, he said. I'm out of here. He hurried out of the club. The stranger and I compared notes. I told him a more complete version of my Tony story, and he said it matched what Tony had told him. When he got home from Memphis, Tony had turned his life over to God and married his fiancée. He now spent a good part of his time and money helping other people get off drugs, the stranger said. I can't believe this, I said. Do you know what the odds are that we would meet? I didn't know myself. 1,000,000 to 1? 1,000,000,000 to 1? It was impossible that this guy was here. It was impossible that I was here at the same time he walked in asking for directions. It was impossible that he knew not only my story, but even my name. It was impossible. Despite this miraculous encounter, you will not be surprised to learn that I did not go to church with Cindy the next day. Since Dale had abandoned me, I used it as an excuse to find more cocaine. I wound up in a Minneapolis crack house where I hit the pipe hard for the next 2 days. Instead of quitting, my crack use escalated. I began segregating myself from a lot of my non crack using friends and family, especially Cindy. Shortly after my run in with Officer Larry, she had called me at the house in the woods. Mike, the pillow company is just a platform for a bigger thing, Cindy said. She added that God had revealed this to her in prayer. By now, I was used to people claiming to have weird messages for me from God, and Cindy's statement triggered a memory. While I was packing up our family home in order to move in with Rachel, a notebook had fallen out of a picture frame. When I pulled it off the wall, it contained the 6-page out of body message to self I'd hidden behind the album cover. That was the first time I'd become aware of this whole idea of a platform. Now, though, I had this internal sense that I was losing everything, not just material things, but losing myself. At this point, I didn't see how I was ever going to be able to help anybody. I know, I told my sister simply. Well, okay, she said. But God also showed me that if you don't quit smoking, you're going to die. I laughed. Cindy, smoking is like my fifth worst vice. I knew she meant cigarettes. I think I'm going to be okay. About a week later, my phone rang again. The shouting began as soon as I picked up. It's not cigarettes, it's crack cocaine. You're smoking crack cocaine? It was Cindy again. Are you kidding me? I'm not smoking crack, I said. I went a few verbal rounds with my sister. I know you're lying, Cindy said. Again, God had spoken to her in prayer. If you keep doing it, you're going to die. Abruptly, she hung up. Suddenly, I realized that I'd somehow woven God's messages to me into my rationale for continuing to indulge my addictions. I'm no theologian, but it seemed to me that if God was all powerful, and if He had destined me to do great things with my pillow, then nothing could stop that, including me. That meant that until the time came for the platform, whatever it was, I could do whatever I wanted, including drugs. But Cindy's words helped me begin to realize the error of my thinking. Maybe it was a two-way street. Maybe I had to cooperate with God. Shortly afterward, I received an undeniable reminder of my mortality. In the summer of 2008, medical testing revealed I had precancerous growths. A surgeon removed them, and I was fine. But if I had found them later, they could have been fatal. That was the day I started talking to God. I'm going to quit, I told him. I'm not going to quit today. but I'm definitely going to quit. After I made that promise, things began to unravel quickly. In August, I had to deliver pillows to Jim and others who were manning my booth at the Minnesota State Fair, my biggest event of the year. I drove to the fairgrounds with a truckload of pillows, but I couldn't make myself go in to deliver them. I had been up all night smoking crack and felt so sketchy and paranoid that I backed my truck into a pole in the parking lot. Then I found out that the numbers coming out of the fair were down, way down. Usually, the fair proceeds were enough to inject badly needed cash into my company, but this time, receipts were so low that I wouldn't be able to cover expenses. I decided to take the fair proceeds to Laughlin and multiply the money by counting cards. Instead, I lost hand after hand, hour after hour. The 1.5% advantage I should have had seemed permanently suspended. I decided to abandon Laughlin for Las Vegas in search of a greener pastures and cocaine, which I'd never been able to find in Laughlin. I caught a ride with a Riverside blackjack dealer and his girlfriend. It was September 12th, 2008. How do I remember the date so clearly? Because of what happened next. Halfway to Las Vegas, we got pulled over for speeding. The cop asked us all to show our ID. I didn't sweat it. For once, I had a valid Minnesota's driver's license. I also had zero warrants out for my arrest. We'd been stopped on the highway for almost 20 minutes when another highway patrol officer pulled up. I looked at the other two in the car. I know this drill, I said. One of you's going to jail. But the next thing I knew, officers appeared at my window with guns drawn. Out of the car! Out of the car! They yelled. A thorough frisking and a pair of handcuffs later, I found myself in the Clark County Detention Center in downtown Las Vegas at the beginning of a nightmare. I didn't know why I'd been arrested and kept asking, why am I here? But no one would answer. I was not given a phone call. I was not allowed to contact a lawyer. Instead, they placed my possessions in a Ziploc bag, snapped a mugshot, and took my fingerprints. Next, I was hustled to a small holding cell crammed with at least 20 people. The biggest guy in the cell was using the only roll of toilet paper as a pillow, and another big guy was using the toilet as a chair. Neither man seemed inclined to share. A long night began. I became thirstier and thirstier, but the water fountain was behind the toilet king, and he wouldn't let anyone near it. Meanwhile, the jailers gave us almost nothing to drink. At least 24 hours passed. A guard pulled me out of the holding cell and took me to another confinement area. It was nearly pitch black, but I couldn't make out the shadows of bunks everywhere. I still didn't know why I was there. The officer told me that the jail was on lockdown and gave me my bunk number. If you make any noise, he said, lockdown will be extended. I had no intention of making any noise. All I could focus on was how thirsty I was, so I asked to use the bathroom. When permission was granted, I sprinted to a water fountain, sucked down what seemed like a gallon, and worked my way to my bunk in the dark. I was just about to climb up when the guy in the bottom bunk said, "You touch my bunk, I'll kill you." I basically had to do a chin up to get onto my rack, into my rack. I had just made it up there when I heard a whisper. "Hey, fool, you just drank all that water. You you better pee your pants because if you ask to use the bathroom, You're going to get us all more time in lockdown. A third voice came out of the dark. You pee your pants, I'll kill you. That night seemed eternal. When the lights finally came on and the inmates started moving around, I climbed down and the pain from my bladder seared through me. I had started to crawl to the bathroom when a guard came and kicked me in the gut. What do you think you're doing? He snapped. Get off the floor. I spent 3 days in that jail without knowing why I was being held. During that time, I saw a mentally disabled man beaten by other inmates. I saw the guards call the prisoners names and withhold basic humane treatment. I reflected that this was where my choices had brought me. I had arrived in hell. Finally, on Tuesday, I appeared in shackles before a judge via video feed. He informed me that I was being charged with a felony because I had stolen from a casino. I was stunned. As it turned out, he was talking about the $100 marker at the Stardust Casino, the one I had signed for 7 years before when I'd taken the Schmitty's regulars to Vegas. The guy had never paid the marker, and the Stardust reported it as a felony theft. Years earlier, the Stardust had given me a letter absolving me of this debt, but the property had since closed permanently. Then, in 2006, developers demolished it in a spectacular nighttime explosion. Apparently, the Stardust bosses had sold their unpaid debt for collection, and my marker was somehow still on their list. Video judge set my bail at $1,300, but I still sat in jail for 3 more days. First, Corey hesitated to send bail money because he heard I got busted with a drug dealer instead of a card dealer. Then, even though I'd made bail, the jailers let me sit for another 24 hours, saying, we'll let you out when we feel like it. That's a direct quote. I'd had it. My annual duck hunting trip with Darren was the next day, and I exploded in anger at the meanest guard in the jail. Years of pent up rage blasted out all at once, and words stampeded from my mouth as I called him every name I could think of. The entire jail went silent as the inmates waited to see what this guard would do to me. But all he did was smile, happy he had finally broken me. Without saying a word, he walked over, picked up a phone, and ordered my release. Later on, the charge against me was dismissed. The Stardust marker had indeed been forgiven years earlier. It had all been a huge mistake, or had it? Looking back, I think it was God still trying to get my attention, and he wasn't finished. Darren was 18 now, and he'd been living with Rachel and me for about 5 months. I had congratulated myself for moving him in with me, but now I have to admit the truth. I was so deep into drugs at this point that his presence in the house was almost an afterthought. Still, we did have this hunt planned, and I was looking forward to it. I had been taking this annual trip since I was a kid and never missed it, no matter what else happened during the year. It was like an anchor in the chaos of my life. I got home from Nevada just in time. Darren and I packed our gear and headed down to Iowa, where we hunted Sturm's Pond. Dick and Kathy Sturm had trusted me on their land for more than 40 years, even through the times I was in trouble and people wondered why they didn't ban me. That always meant a lot to me. Sitting in a duck blind under a brilliant autumn sky, Darren and I brought down bird after bird. When we pulled into our driveway a few days later, 20 ducks and geese lay in the truck bed, cleaned and dressed. It was twilight as I braked to a stop in front of the house in the woods and cut the engine. After my week in that hellhole jail, I was grateful for the quality time spent with my son. We unloaded the truck and I shut the garage door. I was heading around to the front porch when I noticed Darren wasn't following me. I stopped and turned to him. Aren't you coming in? I noticed that his lips were quivering. and he looked about 2 seconds away from bursting into tears. "What's wrong?" I said. "I want to go live with Charlie," Darren said, his tone timid and unnaturally high. It was a gut punch, not only to hear my son say those words, but to see his struggle. By now, Charlie had moved into his own apartment. I could tell instantly that Darren had spent hours, maybe days, building up his courage to say he wanted to move in with his brother. Darren knew it would break my heart. It then occurred to me that his car was probably already packed. I looked at him steadily, hoping he couldn't tell I was holding back tears. "Well, that's fine," I said gently. I will never forget the way Darren said those words. I know how hard it was for him, and I felt just horrible that he'd had to watch the chaos of his dad going down. And I felt guilty too, because I'd realized that I'd been using Darren as my last little bit of stability, as though maybe I wasn't as bad a dad as I had been when I abandoned the kids at our family home. All my worst fears became crystal clear in that moment. I really wasn't a good father. I wasn't even a good man. I had let my addictions destroy my own family. So that was September, and God still wasn't done. In October, my pillow. It turned out that while I was in Laughlin losing the Minnesota State Fair money, some people had told Jim I was an addict. To that point, I had kept my drug addiction a secret from him. He had lived through so much of my chaos, including my divorce and my relationship with Rachel. He knew I was struggling to keep my pillow afloat, but this new piece of information gave him a different perspective on everything. Jim called to tell me he was going to work for his brother, who was a trucker. It was a terrible blow. For 3 years, he had been a rock steady source of encouragement and stability. He was on the road for us constantly, selling at home shows across the country. He had even loaned money to My Pillow on more than one occasion. With him quitting, it felt like the heart was being ripped out of my company. But I gritted my teeth and refused to get emotional. When Jim was diagnosed with cancer, I hadn't believed he would die because I had seen him in my future, working with me at the pillow company. I didn't believe him now either. I thought he'd be back. "That's okay, Jim," I said. "I understand. Good luck in your new career." My life had been crumbling for quite some time, but now it seemed to be picking up speed. One by one, I was losing everyone I cared about, the people who had kept me from coming completely undone. I couldn't help but think of what Cindy had already told me twice in 2008. "You can't keep standing in front of semis, Mike. The window is closing, and God is tired of waiting. Even if you don't die, He's going to pick somebody else." This has been a reading of What Are the Odds by Mike Lindell, from crack addict to CEO. Digital